There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A Tuesday night, the low hum of the refrigerator, the scent of rain on concrete rising through an open window. They were the camouflage of routine, and only in retrospect, when you trace the timeline of your own heart, do you see them for what they were. The turning of a key in a lock you never knew was there. A threshold. For me, that moment was the sound of a bedroom door clicking open when it was supposed to be closed, and a question that was not really a question at all, spoken into the quiet space between one breath and the next. It was the moment the architecture of my life began to change, when a friendship that had been my shelter threatened to become something with foundations so deep they might shatter everything if they failed. Or, if they held, become a home I had only ever allowed myself to dream of. Julian was the axis around which my world had quietly, and perhaps foolishly, spun for nearly a decade. We met in the chlorine-scented ecosystem of collegiate athletics, a world that felt both immense and suffocatingly small. He was the star, the one whose name echoed off the tiled walls during meets. Julian, the effortless freestyle sprinter, a body carved from sunlight and dedication. He moved through the water like he was born of it, a seamless union of muscle and momentum. I, on the other hand, was a diver. My world was the opposite of his. His was a race against the clock, a horizontal churn of power and endurance. Mine was a few seconds of vertical silence, a flight and a fall, a battle against gravity fought in the space between the board and the water's surface. He was noise and glory. I was quiet and precision. He was the story. I was the footnote. Our friendship, therefore, should have been an unlikely one. But it was forged in the shared exhaustion of 5 a.m. practices, in the smell of damp towels, and the taste of cheap coffee from the campus dining hall. We were both governed by the same relentless schedule, the same monastic devotion to our sport. I think he was drawn to my stillness, a quiet harbor in the churning sea of his own life, which was full of expectations and the constant, pressing weight of his own potential. And I, of course, was drawn to his light. It was impossible not to be. Julian had a warmth that was gravitational. It pulled people into his orbit, and I was just another satellite, content to circle him, to reflect a small fraction of his brightness. I learned the cartography of his moods, the subtle shift in his posture that meant he was stressed, the specific cadence of his laughter when it was genuine versus when it was for show. I became a scholar of Julian, and the central, unspoken thesis of my studies was that I was hopelessly, irrevocably in love with him. It was a quiet, manageable ache, a love I had packed away into a small, sturdy box and stored in the attic of my heart. I had accepted its existence but resolved never to unpack it. He was my best friend. He was, as far as I or anyone else knew, completely and unshakably straight. He had a series of girlfriends, all of them lovely and bright, and utterly deserving of the sun he shone upon them. I was the constant in the background, the one he came to for movie nights when a relationship ended, the one who listened patiently as he dissected first dates and anniversary plans. I played my part so well that I sometimes convinced myself it was all I ever wanted. The role of the supportive best friend, the quiet observer, was a safe one. It guaranteed me a place in his life, and that, I told myself, was more than enough. It had to be. To want more was to risk everything, to gamble with the one relationship that felt like a foundational pillar of my own identity. So I kept my feelings under glass, a museum exhibit for an audience of one. After college, the dynamic seemed set in stone. We got an apartment together, a practical decision that felt, to me, like a profound blessing. Our lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. He was a software consultant now, his days governed by code and conference calls instead of lap times. I was a freelance photographer, my life a patchwork of odd jobs and personal projects, my schedule fluid and often lonely. The apartment became our shared sanctuary. His side of the living room was a controlled chaos of tech gadgets and running shoes. Mine was a stack of art books and the patient, waiting eye of a camera on a tripod. We coexisted in a state of easy, unspoken harmony. We knew each other's coffee orders, the exact moment to leave the other alone. The precise tone of voice that meant, "I need to talk," versus, "I need silence." It was a domesticity so profound, so deeply ingrained, that it sometimes made the ache in my chest feel unbearable. It was a phantom limb, this love I had for him, a constant, phantom presence of a life I couldn't have. The catalyst, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion but a quiet implosion. His girlfriend of 2 years, Sarah, ended things. There was no shouting match, no tearful confrontation that I overheard through the thin apartment walls. It was a conversation that happened over dinner at a restaurant I'd never been to, and Julian came home looking not heartbroken, but hollowed out. He walked in, dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door with a clatter that sounded too loud in the stillness, and just stood there for a moment, his back to me. He was a statue of a man I used to know. The broad shoulders, which I'd once seen carry the weight of a team's hopes, seemed to slump under an invisible burden. "She's gone," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. It was a statement of fact, like reporting the weather. I didn't know what to do. The script for this scene was one I knew well. I was supposed to offer him a beer, put on a stupid action movie, and let him vent or sit in silence as he chose. I was the designated emotional first aid station. But this felt different. The other breakups had been temporary storms, dramatic but passing. This felt like a shift in the climate, a long winter setting in. He finally turned around, and the look in his eyes wasn't sadness. It was a profound and terrifying loneliness, a look of being utterly adrift. He seemed surprised to see me sitting there on the couch, as if he'd forgotten we shared a home. As if he'd forgotten he wasn't entirely alone. For weeks, he was a ghost in our apartment. The vibrant energy that usually filled every room he entered was gone, replaced by a heavy quiet. He spent most of his time in his bedroom, the door, which was usually wide open, now perpetually closed. It was a physical manifestation of his retreat from the world, from me. The closed door became a symbol, a barrier I was terrified to cross. Our easy companionship evaporated. We were two strangers living on opposite sides of a wall, the silence between us thick with everything he couldn't say and everything I was too afraid to ask. I missed him. It was a strange thing to miss someone who was only 15 feet away, but the distance felt oceanic. I would lie awake at night, listening for any sound from his room, and hear nothing but the hum of the city outside, a lonely counterpoint to the silence inside. Then came the Tuesday night. It was late, past midnight, and a soft rain was whispering against the window panes. I couldn't sleep. I was on the couch, a book open in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in an hour. I was just listening to the rain, nursing a cup of chamomile tea, when I heard it. A soft click, the sound of his bedroom door opening. I froze, my heart giving a sudden, painful lurch in my chest. I didn't look up, pretending to be absorbed in my book, my entire body a knot of nervous anticipation. I heard his footsteps, hesitant on the hardwood floor of the hallway. He stopped in the doorway of the living room, a silhouette framed against the darkness behind him. I could feel his gaze on me. I could feel the weight of his indecision. The air grew thick, charged with a question he hadn't yet spoken. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic patter of the rain. It felt like standing on the high dive again, that moment of perfect, terrifying stillness before the fall. Finally, his voice, so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Leo." I forced myself to look up, schooling my features into an expression of casual inquiry. "Yeah? What's up?" My voice sounded surprisingly steady. He stood there, wrapped in an old university sweatshirt, his hair a mess, looking younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. He gestured vaguely toward the living room, toward the empty space at the other end of the large sectional couch, where I Saturday can I? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The question was not about permission to enter a room in his own apartment. It was about something else entirely. It was a request for proximity, for a reprieve from the lonely landscape of his own mind, his own room. My carefully constructed walls, the ones that kept my feelings contained and our friendships safe, trembled. The correct answer, the safe answer, was to make a joke, to tell him to grab a blanket, to keep the emotional distance intact. But the sight of him, so lost and so close, dismantled my defenses. "Of course," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He walked over and sank onto the far end of the couch, pulling a throw blanket over his legs. He didn't speak. He just sat there, staring at the dark screen of the television. We sat in silence for a long time, 2 points at opposite ends of a vast, upholstered continent. But the geography of the room had changed. The closed door was open. He was here. He had crossed a threshold, and I knew, with a certainty that was both exhilarating and terrifying, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. I stayed awake for hours after he had drifted off to sleep, his breathing evening out into a soft, rhythmic whisper. I just watched him, a sentinel in the low lamplight, guarding a peace he had sought in my presence. And I felt the first, tentative tremor of a hope I had long ago buried. That night established a new, unspoken ritual. It did not happen every night, but it happened often enough to become a pattern, a new language we were learning to speak. It would always begin the same way. I would be on the couch, reading or editing photos on my laptop, and his door would open. He would appear in the doorway, a silent question in his posture. I would give a small, almost imperceptible nod, and he would come and take his place on the other end of the couch. The first few times, we maintained a careful distance, an invisible line drawn down the center of the cushions, a buffer zone of neutrality. We were two solitary islands in a shared sea, close enough to feel the tide of each other's presence, but not touching. For me, these nights were a form of exquisite torture. My senses were dialed to an impossible level of acuity. I was aware of everything. The subtle shift of his weight on the cushions, the sound of him turning a page in a magazine, the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in his hair. My entire being was focused on the few feet of space that separated us, a space that felt both cavernous and electrically charged. I would try to focus on my book, on the glow of my screen, but my peripheral vision was entirely consumed by him. I was terrified of making a wrong move, of breathing too loudly, of doing anything that might break the fragile truce we had established. I was a wildlife photographer who had stumbled upon a rare, timid creature, and I was holding my breath, praying it wouldn't bolt. Then, one evening about a month into this new routine, the geography shifted. It was a cold night, the kind of damp, bone-deep chill that seeps through the window frames of old apartment buildings. Julian came out, looking exhausted from a long day at work. He settled onto his end of the couch, but he seemed restless, unable to get comfortable. He kept shifting, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. I watched him from the corner of my eye, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. After a few minutes of this fidgeting, he sighed. "It's freezing in here," he mumbled, more to himself than to me. Before I could respond, he moved. It was a small, almost insignificant adjustment. He shifted toward the center of the couch, turning onto his side so that his back was facing me, and drew his knees up slightly. In doing so, his back came to rest lightly against my side. It was the barest of contacts, the fabric of his sweatshirt against the fabric of my t-shirt, but it sent a jolt through me that was so powerful I was surprised he didn't feel it. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending in my side, from my hip to my shoulder, was suddenly on fire, screaming with the awareness of his presence. This was new territory. This was a breach of the unspoken treaty. My mind raced, trying to decode the gesture. Was it accidental? Was it a subconscious search for warmth, utterly devoid of any deeper meaning? Or was it something else? The plausible deniability was perfect. He was cold. He was tired. It meant nothing. It was the most logical explanation, and yet my heart refused to believe it. This felt intentional, a test. He was waiting to see if I would pull away, if I would flinch. I did not move. I sat there, as still as stone, my book forgotten in my lap. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to project an aura of calm I was nowhere near feeling. Inside, a hurricane was raging. Hope, a terrifying and beautiful monster, was rising from the depths where I had chained it. It told me that this contact was a question, an offering. Fear, its constant companion, whispered that I was a fool, that I was reading a universe of meaning into a simple, platonic gesture. I was imprinting my own desperate desires onto a blank canvas. He must have felt the tension in me, the sudden rigidity of my body. After a moment, he spoke, his voice slightly muffled by the cushion. "Is this okay?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. He had acknowledged it. He had named the moment, stripping away a layer of its deniability. He was giving me an out, a chance to re-establish the boundary. He was also, in his own way, asking for reassurance. My answer would define the new rules of our engagement. My throat was tight. I swallowed, and the sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice raspy. "It's okay." I felt more than saw the subtle relaxation of his body, the way the muscles in his back seemed to release a tension I hadn't even realized they were holding. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of contentment, and settled more firmly against me. And then he was asleep, just like that. He had crossed the line, asked for permission, and upon receiving it, had surrendered to exhaustion, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my composure. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the solid, warm weight of him pressed against my side, a physical anchor in the storm of my emotions. The world had shrunk to this single point of contact, this quiet, unbelievable intimacy. It was everything I had ever wanted, and it was terrifying, because I had no idea what it meant. The ritual evolved again after that night. The invisible line down the middle of the couch was gone, erased. Now, when he came out, he would settle closer to me from the start. Sometimes he would lean his head against my shoulder as we watched a movie, the weight of it a comforting, electrifying pressure. Other times, he would stretch out, his feet ending up in my lap, a casual intimacy that felt anything but casual to me. I became an expert at feigning nonchalance, at continuing to read or type as if I didn't feel the brand of his touch on my skin. My life became a performance of placid friendship, while my inner world was a constant, chaotic symphony of yearning and analysis. I began to see him through the lens of my camera, even when I wasn't holding it. I saw the way the light from the window caught the line of his jaw, the exhaustion that settled in the fine lines around his eyes after a long day, the way his hands, strong and capable from years of pulling himself through water, were surprisingly gentle as they handled a ceramic mug. I was composing photographs of him in my mind, snapshots of quiet vulnerability that no one else was allowed to see. He was letting me in, allowing me to witness a part of him that was unpolished and unguarded. He was trusting me with his exhaustion, his loneliness, his need for simple, uncomplicated comfort. The problem was, for me, it was anything but uncomplicated. Every touch, every shared silence, was a log on the fire of my long-suppressed feelings. The hope that had been a tremor was now a constant, low-grade earthquake, shaking the foundations of my carefully managed peace. I was living on a knife's edge, caught between the profound joy of this new closeness and the paralyzing fear of what would happen if I misinterpreted it. If I made a move, if I said the wrong thing, the delicate ecosystem we had built could collapse in an instant. He would retreat back into his room, the door would close, and I would be left with a silence more profound than any I had known before. The risk was too great, so I remained still. I remained the quiet observer, the safe harbor, the friend. I let him lead, and I followed, my heart in my throat with every step we took into this new, undefined territory. And then came the phone call that changed the atmospheric pressure of our entire world. Julian had to go on a week-long business trip to Chicago. It was the first time we'd been apart for more than a day since the breakup, since our ritual had begun. The first night he was gone, the apartment felt cavernous and unnervingly quiet. The couch seemed absurdly large, a vast, empty expanse. I found myself sitting in my usual spot, expecting to hear the click of his door, my body braced for a presence that never came. The silence was an active, aggressive thing. I hadn't realized how much I had come to depend on our quiet evenings, how much his presence had become the anchor of my own days. The loneliness that settled over me was sharp and unfamiliar. It was a reflection of the loneliness I had been soothing in him. On the third night of his trip, my phone rang. It was late, nearly 11 o'clock. I saw his name on the screen, and my heart did its familiar, foolish leap. I tried to sound casual when I answered. "Hey, how's Chicago?" "Cold," he said. His voice was different over the phone, stripped of the physical presence that usually accompanied it. It sounded small, thin, and very far away. There was a faint sound of traffic in the background, the lonely sound of a city at night. "Boring. I'm just sitting in my hotel room, long day of meetings," I asked, falling back on the familiar script of our friendship. The longest, he was quiet for a moment. I could hear him take a breath. "It's weird," he said, his voice dropping a little lower. "I can't sleep." I waited, my knuckles white where I was gripping my phone. "It's this hotel room," he continued, almost rambling. "It's too quiet. Sterile. You know." "I know," I said softly. Another pause, this one longer, heavier. I could almost feel him on the other end of the line, wrestling with a thought, deciding whether or not to give it voice. When he finally spoke, the words were hesitant, as if he was tasting them before letting them go. "I miss our couch." The words landed in the quiet of my apartment with the force of a physical blow. He missed the couch. He missed the ritual. He missed the specific geography of our shared space, the comfort we had built there without ever naming it. My mind reeled. It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging what these evenings meant, to admitting that they were as necessary for him as they had become for me. I couldn't find my voice. I didn't know what to say. My silence stretched, and I think he mistook it for confusion. He let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. "God, that sounds stupid, doesn't it? Missing a piece of furniture, no," I said, my voice finally working. It came out stronger than I expected. "It doesn't sound stupid at all." The line went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was an intimate silence, a space where something important had been said and was now being allowed to settle. I felt like we were standing on opposite sides of a canyon, and he had just sent a signal, a flare of light into the darkness, and I had signaled back. And then, just as I thought the conversation was over, he said one more thing. His voice was a near whisper, so faint I wondered if I was imagining it, if it was just the static on the line, if it was just the desperate projection of my own heart. "I miss you." And then he cleared his throat, said a hasty good night, and hung up, leaving me in the echoing silence of my apartment. I lowered the phone from my ear, staring at the blank wall in front of me. He hadn't said he missed hanging out. He hadn't said he missed home. He had said, "I miss you," a simple, devastating, three-word sentence that had just dismantled the entire structure of our friendship, leaving us both standing in the rubble, exposed and vulnerable. The hope I had been trying to suppress was no longer a monster in the deep. It was free, and it was singing a song that sounded terrifyingly like a beginning. The remaining days of Julian's trip passed in a blur of anxious anticipation. His words echoed in my mind, a constant refrain. I played the conversation over and over, dissecting every pause, every shift in his tone. I tried to temper my soaring hopes with the cold water of logic. He was lonely. He was in an unfamiliar city. He was still reeling from his breakup. It was a moment of weakness, a platonic sentiment amplified by distance. But the memory of his voice, the raw, quiet vulnerability in that whispered confession, refused to be rationalized away. It had felt like a key turning in a lock. I was terrified of what I might find on the other side of the door. The day he was due to return, I was a wreck. I cleaned the apartment obsessively, arranging and rearranging things as if the perfect placement of a book or a coaster could somehow control the outcome of the evening. I was trying to build a sense of normalcy, a stage set for a scene I didn't know how to act in. When I heard his keys in the lock late that afternoon, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I took a deep breath and walked out of my room to greet him, a carefully crafted expression of casual welcome on my face. He looked exhausted. The trip had clearly taken its toll. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his shoulders were slumped with the weariness of travel. He dropped his duffel bag by the door and gave me a tired smile. It was a real smile, though. It reached his eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice raspy. "Hey," I replied. "Welcome back. How was the flight?" "Long," He ran a hand through his already messy hair. I think I'm going to take a shower and just crash for a bit. Good idea, I said, my voice betraying none of the frantic energy coursing through my veins. He disappeared into his room, and the apartment fell silent again. I was left alone with my thoughts, which were now spiraling. Was that it? Was he going to retreat to his room, and we would pretend the phone call never happened? Was he regretting his moment of vulnerability? The uncertainty was agonizing. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands shaking slightly, and settled onto the couch, the battleground where everything would, or would not, happen. I picked up my book, but the words were just black squiggles on a white page. My entire being was attuned to the sounds coming from his part of the apartment. The rush of the shower, the soft thud of a closing drawer, the silence that followed. An hour passed, then two. The sun began to set, painting the walls of the living room in hues of orange and purple. The lights softened, the shadows deepened. And then, I heard it, the soft click of his bedroom door. My breath hitched. He appeared in the doorway, just as he had so many times before. He was wearing a clean t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked less haunted than before, but just as tired. He looked at me, sitting on the couch, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, hesitation, maybe even fear. The easy ritual we had built felt fragile now, burdened by the weight of his spoken words. I knew this was a pivotal moment. I could break the tension with a joke, ask him if he wanted to order a pizza, and we could retreat to the safety of our old dynamic. Or I could hold the silence, hold his gaze, and acknowledge that the ground had shifted beneath our feet. I chose silence. I simply looked at him, waiting. He was the one to break it. He walked over to the couch, but instead of sinking into his usual spot at the far end, he sat down much closer to me. Not touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. Close enough that the space between us felt charged and deliberate. He didn't pick up a magazine or the remote control. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the floor between his feet. "Leo," he said, his voice low and serious. He still wasn't looking at me. About the other night, on the phone, here it comes, I thought. The retraction, the apology. I was just tired and lonely speech that would gently but firmly put me back in my box. I braced myself for the impact. He started, then stopped. He shook his head, a gesture of frustration. He finally turned his head to look at me, and his eyes were filled with a raw, terrifying honesty. The easygoing, confident Julian I knew was gone. In his place was someone I had never seen before, someone uncertain and completely unguarded. "I meant it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. My heart stopped. It just ceased to beat for a solid second. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. He meant it. He saw the shock on my face, and a faint, sad smile touched his lips. I know. I've been a mess since Sarah left. I've been leaning on you, using you as a crutch, and that's not fair. It's not like that," I managed to say, finding my voice. "You're my friend, Julian. It's what we do." "No," he insisted, shaking his head again. "It's more than that. I realized it when I was in Chicago, sitting in that empty hotel room. The thing I wanted, the thing I missed, it wasn't just the couch. It wasn't just home." He held my gaze, his own unwavering, searching. "It was you. Being here. With you. And it's not just about feeling less lonely anymore. It's about feeling right. This," he gestured to the space between us, to the quiet room, "feels more right than anything has in a very long time." The world tilted on its axis. He was saying the words, the impossible words I had never allowed myself to even hope for. He was articulating the very thing I had been feeling, the sense of profound rightness in our shared quiet. But he still hadn't named it. He was circling the truth, afraid to speak it into existence. He looked down at his hands again, as if the intensity of the confession was too much to bear. "I don't know what I'm doing, Leo. I'm so confused. My whole life, I've had this map. You go to school, you get a job, you find a nice girl, you get married. I was following the map, but it led me here, to this place where none of it feels real. And the only thing that does feel real is sitting here in the dark with you." He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air, a beautiful, terrifying weight. He had laid his entire, confused heart at my feet. He had taken the bigger risk, spoken the first truth. Now it was my turn. I could leave him there, in his confusion, or I could meet him in that vulnerable space. I shifted slightly on the couch, turning my body to face him more fully. I reached out, my hand trembling, and rested it on his knee. The contact was electric. He flinched, not in rejection, but in surprise, then relaxed into the touch, his eyes fluttering shut for a brief moment. "Julian," I said, my voice thick with a decade of unspoken emotion. "It feels right to me, too." He opened his eyes and looked at me, a universe of questions swirling in their depths. The air between us grew thin, humming with a kinetic energy that had been building for years. The distance between us was no longer feet and inches, but the space between one heartbeat and the next. He was searching my face for something, permission, understanding, a sign that he wasn't alone on this precipice. His gaze dropped to my lips, then flickered back up to my eyes. It was a question, the most vulnerable question he had ever asked, and he asked it without a single word. He leaned in, slowly, tentatively, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to stop him, to retreat to the safety of what we were. His movement was a study in hesitation, a physical manifestation of his fear and his desire. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I met him halfway, closing the small distance that remained between us. His lips touched mine. It wasn't a passionate, movie screen kiss. It was softer than that, more profound. It was a question and an answer, a confession and an absolution. It was hesitant and gentle and unbelievably, breathtakingly real. It was the taste of salt and rain and a decade of waiting. It was the feeling of coming home to a place you never knew you were searching for. In that single, quiet moment of contact, the entire architecture of my world was rebuilt, no longer a shelter against the storm, but a home, finally and truly, a home. The kiss ended as gently as it began. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes were closed, a faint tremor running through his body. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, our worlds having just collided and reformed into something new and terrifying and beautiful. I could feel the frantic beat of his heart, or maybe it was mine. I couldn't tell them apart. "Oh," he whispered, a single, breathy syllable of dawning realization. It wasn't a word of regret or confusion. It was a sound of discovery, of a puzzle piece clicking into place. But the dawn, as it turned out, was a false one. The morning after was not filled with the quiet joy I had allowed myself to imagine. It was filled with a thick, suffocating silence. I woke up on the couch, a blanket tucked around me that I didn't remember pulling over myself. The apartment was still. Too still. I sat up, my heart a cold knot of dread in my stomach. Julian's bedroom door, which had become a symbol of his openness, was closed. Tightly closed. A piece of paper was on the coffee table, a single sheet torn from a legal pad. His familiar, sharp handwriting covered it. For words. "I'm sorry. I'm an idiot." The floor fell out from under me. I read the words again and again, as if they might change. But they remained, a stark, brutal repudiation of everything that had happened between us. He was sorry. He thought he was an idiot. He had retreated, panicked, and slammed the door, both literally and figuratively, on the fragile, beautiful thing we had just created. The hope that had been soaring just hours before crashed and burned, leaving nothing but the acrid smoke of humiliation and a pain so sharp it stole my breath. He was gone. I knew without checking that he had left for work early, avoiding the morning, avoiding me. He had run, and I was left alone in the aftermath, in the quiet apartment that now felt like a crime scene. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. I wasn't a home. I was a halfway house, a temporary shelter he had used to weather the storm of his own loneliness. And now that the storm was passing, or now that he had confronted what that shelter actually meant, he was horrified. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been a mistake. His mistake. The next few days were some of the longest of my life. We were back to being ghosts in our own home, but this time the silence was not passive, it was a weapon. It was filled with the shrapnel of what had happened. He came home late and went straight to his room. I heard him moving around in there, but the door remained closed. The couch remained empty. We avoided each other with a grim, practiced choreography, our paths crossing only for fleeting, awkward seconds in the hallway, where we would exchange mumbled greetings without making eye contact. The pain was a physical thing. It was a constant pressure behind my ribs, a tightness in my throat. It was the agony of having something you didn't even know you were allowed to want dangled in front of you, only to have it snatched away. The worst part was the shame. I felt deeply, profoundly ashamed, as if my wanting him had somehow been a violation, as if my quiet, decade-long love was something grotesque that had finally been exposed to the light and had sent him running in disgust. After 3 days of this silent torture, I knew I couldn't go on. The ambiguity was killing me. I would rather have a clean, painful break than this slow death by 1,000 silent cuts. I needed to hear it from him. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me it was a mistake, that he was sorry, that he was straight, and that we could never speak of it again. I needed the finality of it, the brutal cauterization of the wound. That evening, I waited. I didn't sit on the couch. I stood in the kitchen, my arms crossed, a sentinel at my post. When I heard his keys in the door, my entire body tensed. He walked in, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor. He started to head for the hallway, for the safety of his room. "Julian," my voice stopped him in his tracks. He froze, his back to me. He didn't turn around. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was quiet, but it held a steel I didn't know I possessed. He stood there for a long moment, and I thought he might just ignore me, that he might just walk away and close his door, leaving me standing there alone. But then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, he slowly turned to face me. He looked terrible. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked as miserable as I felt. "Leo, I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't get to do that," I said, stepping toward him. My own pain was making me brave. "You don't get to kiss me like that, and then leave a note. You don't get to hide in your room and pretend I don't exist. You owe me more than that." He flinched as if I'd struck him. "I know," he said, finally meeting my eyes. And what I saw there was not disgust or revulsion. It was pure, unadulterated fear. He was terrified. "I know I do. I'm so sorry, Leo. I never should have. I messed everything up." "What did you mess up, Julian?" I pressed, my voice still quiet but insistent. "Our friendship? Or your neat little life plan?" The question hit its mark. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't know," he said, the words torn from him. "That's the problem. I don't know anything anymore. I feel like I'm losing my mind." He looked so lost, so utterly broken, that my anger began to recede, replaced by the familiar, aching pull of my love for him. I took another step closer. "Talk to me," I pleaded, my voice softening. "Please, just tell me what's going on in your head. Even if it's what I don't want to hear. Just be honest with me." He stared at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked like a cornered animal. And then, something in him broke. A single tear tracked its way down his cheek, and he let out a choked sob. He collapsed onto the floor, his back against the wall, and buried his face in his hands. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "That's what's messing me up. The kiss. It wasn't a mistake. It felt." He trailed off, unable to say the word. I knelt in front of him, the cold hardwood floor seeping through my jeans. It felt right. I finished for him, my voice a whisper. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears, and nodded. "It felt so right. And that terrifies me. Because it's not supposed to. It's not on the map, Leo. You're not on the map. This isn't who I am. Who are you, then?" I asked gently. "I don't know," he cried, his voice raw with anguish. "I thought I was the guy who falls in love with Sarah. The guy who has a wife and kids and a house in the suburbs. But when I was with her, I always felt like I was playing a part one was good at, but it was still a performance. And then she left, and the stage was empty, and I was just me. And I was so lonely. And then sitting on the couch with you, that was the first time in my life I didn't feel like I was performing. I felt seen, and I needed it so much. and I thought it was just friendship, just comfort. But then I was in Chicago, and all I could think about was you. And I realized that what I felt wasn't just need. It was more. And it scared me so much I couldn't breathe. Because if that's real, then my whole life, everything I thought I was, has been a lie. He finally said it all. The whole, messy, terrified truth. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was running from a truth so profound it threatened to undo his entire identity. I reached out and gently took his hands, pulling them away from his face. I held them in mine. Maybe it wasn't a lie, I said softly. Maybe it was just the prologue. Maybe you're not the person you thought you were. And maybe, I squeezed his hands. That's okay. He stared at our joined hands, then up at my face. The fear was still in his eyes, but underneath it, a tiny flicker of something else was beginning to dawn. Relief. The relief of being seen, of being understood, of having his deepest, most terrifying secret met not with judgment, but with acceptance. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. Me neither, I admitted. But we can figure it out. If you want to. We can just be together. No maps. No labels. Just this. He looked at me, really looked at me, for a long, silent moment. The storm in his eyes began to calm. The fear began to recede. And in its place, I saw the same fragile hope that had been living inside of me for a decade. He gave a small, shaky nod. Okay, he breathed. Okay. It was not a triumphant declaration. It was a quiet surrender. A surrender to the truth. A surrender to us. And in the quiet of our hallway, kneeling on the floor, holding hands amidst the wreckage of who we used to be, we finally, truly, began. The days that followed our conversation in the hallway were quiet and tentative, like the first days of spring after a long, hard winter. The crushing weight of unspoken things had lifted, but we were left in a new landscape, one we didn't know how to navigate. We were no longer just friends, but we weren't anything else, not officially. We had agreed to have no maps, but the absence of a clear path was both freeing and nerve-wracking. We were learning a new language, and our first words were clumsy and hesitant. The couch ritual returned, but it was different now. The pretense was gone. He would come and sit next to me, and the space between us was no longer a buffer zone, but an invitation. One night, he simply laid his head in my lap while I was reading. He didn't say anything, just settled in as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I froze for a second, my old anxieties flaring, before I forced myself to relax. I rested my book on my chest and tentatively reached down, my fingers brushing against his hair. It was soft, and I gently, slowly, began to run my fingers through it. He let out a sigh, a sound of such profound contentment that it vibrated through my whole body, and I felt a knot of tension I hadn't even known I was carrying begin to dissolve. We didn't talk about it. We just let the action speak for itself. This became our way. We communicated through small, quiet gestures. A hand on the small of my back as we passed in the kitchen. His leg pressed against mine under the table as we ate takeout. Me bringing him a cup of coffee in the morning, our fingers brushing as he took the mug. Each touch was a quiet reaffirmation, a sentence in our new, silent language. It was a slow, gentle process of building trust, of creating a new foundation on the ground we had cleared. Julian's bedroom door remained open now. Always. It was no longer a sign of his need for comfort, but a simple statement of fact. The barrier was gone. A few weeks after our talk, I woke up in the middle of the night on the couch, my neck stiff. As I sat up, I saw him standing in the doorway of his room, watching me. You know, he said, his voice husky with sleep. There's room in here. It was an invitation, plain and simple. No pretext of nightmares or cold. Just an offering of shared space. I got up from the couch, my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm, and walked to his room. I slid into the bed beside him, and he immediately rolled onto his side, wrapping an arm around my waist and pulling me against his chest. I could feel the steady beat of his heart against my back. He buried his face in my hair and breathed in deeply. "This is better," he mumbled, his voice already thick with returning sleep. I lay there in the dark, wrapped in his arms, in the warmth of his bed, and felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was it. This was the home I had been afraid to even dream of. It wasn't built on grand declarations or passionate drama. It was built on quiet Tuesday nights, on shared silence, on gentle touches, and on the terrifying, beautiful honesty of two people choosing to find their way in the dark together. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The confusion in Julian's eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet certainty, a calm that I had never seen in him before. He was no longer performing. He was just being. And I, the quiet observer, had finally stepped out from behind the lens. I was no longer just documenting a life. I was living one. We had crossed a threshold that night he first opened his door, not knowing where it would lead. We had stumbled through the darkness of fear and confusion, and we had emerged on the other side, into the soft, gentle light of a new morning, where the architecture of our lives was finally, irrevocably, built for two.